who could go to jail.
For the Shorenstein-Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to the annual Theodore H. White Lecture. I must confess that I felt over the years when introducing such previous lecturers as Walter Cronkite, Benjamin Bradley, and Senator Warren Rudman that I was being objective about each of them. A brief biography, a few anecdotes, a pat on the back, and they were on their own. But tonight I make no pretense to objectivity. Daniel Schorr is one of my oldest and best friends. When we at the Shorenstein-Barone Center considered the rich range of possibilities for the 1993 lecture, the name Schorr was on everyone's list. He was our unanimous choice. Not because he had done anything special in 1993, but simply because he has been so special throughout his long and distinguished career. One quality more than any other, more than his wide-ranging experience as a domestic and foreign correspondent, more than his courage under congressional fire, more than his dogged, aggressive pursuit of a story, like a good teacher, his ability to explain complicated issues of policy, more than all of these things, one quality has always impressed me, and that is his ability to conceptualize a story. It's a little bit of a lesson in exotic journalism. Better than just about any other reporter I know, Dan Schorr can hear a seemingly innocent fact and then a week or two later relate it to another seemingly innocent fact taking place perhaps at the other end of the globe, the other end of the country, the other end of the city. Remember a throwaway comment, a certain gesture of an official, a phrase from a Bill Safire or an Ellen Goodman column? And suddenly the shape of a story begins to form in his mind. Some deep, dark, and embarrassing secret of government, some strategy for a presidential campaign. This is not the result of a leak, a deliberate leak, as so many officials would quickly have you believe, but a capacity to collect and collate data, impressions, experience, knowledge, and that wonderful and special gift that most journalists, most good journalists have, that's intuition. Now, sometimes this gift yields modest results. Once in Moscow, where Dan and I met in the de-Stalinization excitement of 1956, he was the CBS News correspondent, and I was a very young diplomatic attaché at the U.S. Embassy. There was a rumor, a very important one it seemed at the time, that there would be a meeting of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party in late June. Now, I must confess to you that I have told this story so many times that I believe it to be true. I can even visualize it. It was the Queen's birthday party at the British Embassy. Large tables groaning under the weight of large strawberries and whipped cream. A full complement of ambassadors, diplomats, and spies. Reporters in groups in the corner wondering about that rumor. And suddenly the heavy steel gates of the embassy open wide, and Nikita Khrushchev, leader of all the Russias, and the entire Politburo enter. Short men in baggy pants and wide-brimmed hats. This was all pre-Glasnost. And Schorr, who wastes no time, without any fear, approaches Khrushchev. He said, "Mr. Khrushchev, I have a question for you." Khrushchev looks up at him. He says, "You see, Mr. Khrushchev, there's a rumor floating around Moscow these days that there's going to be a meeting of the Central Committee at the end of the month. Now, I want you to understand this clearly. I'm not asking you this question in order to get any news out of you. It's simply that I want to go on vacation at the end of the month. And you see, my office feels that if there's going to be a meeting of the Central Committee, maybe I ought not to go on vacation. Well, Khrushchev looked at Shore with peasant eyes glowing with historic skepticism. And Shore said, "Please, sir, understand, this is not for news. I just want to know if I can go on vacation." And the Soviet leader smiled. He thought for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Shore, go on vacation." Dan was delighted. He had his story, he thought. He thanked Khrushchev and began to leave, at which point Khrushchev added, "And Mr. Shore, if we have a meeting of the Central Committee, we'll have it without you." He's nodding his approval. I've learned a great deal from Dan Shore, even how to fill out an expense account. Dan once purchased or inherited the famous Walter Duranty icebox, named after the legendary New York Times correspondent in the 1920s and 30s, handed down from one generation of Moscow correspondent to another. At the end of the month, Dan sent his expense account to New York. $40 it read for historic icebox. A network accountant, there well ahead of his time, as we now know, struck the item from Dan's account. "Ineligible," New York proclaimed. Never to be outdone by anyone from New York, his hometown, Dan rewrote his expense account. $40 it now read for office water cooler. That was never questioned. Dan Shore covered Moscow, Warsaw, Havana, Bonn, one of Edward R. Murrow's team of outstanding foreign correspondents. In the mid-1960s, Dan's returned to Washington, where he quickly established himself as one of the capital's premier investigative reporters, reporting on anything from healthcare to a certain 1972 break-in in a place called Watergate. And that earned for him an honored spot on Richard Nixon's enemies list. A few years later, Dan covered CIA and FBI scandals and uncovered a secret report which he arranged to have published, and which in turn led the House Ethics Committee to threaten imprisonment if Shore did not disclose the name of his source. Dan refused, stating at a public hearing, to betray a source would mean to dry up many future sources for many future reporters. Shore then left CBS, wrote a book. In 1979, joined a new cable news operation called CNN, which no one at the time really thought would survive. And since 1985, he's become the senior analyst for National Public Radio, performing a rare service for which we are all deeply grateful. He has won many awards, including the Peabody earlier this year, for what was called a lifetime of uncompromising reporting of the highest integrity. He's also been inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Society of Professional Journalists. His theme tonight, press and politics, who's using whom? Theodore White, himself an exceptional reporter, in whose name this lecture series exists, is no doubt listening carefully. Daniel Shore.
I could sit and listen to a lot more of that introduction. Except I know that that is about as far as Marvin's back will take him tonight. And I think that his presence here tonight itself is such a moving gesture to me that I shall very long remember just as being here, never mind all those things he said. The only way to respond to an introduction like that would be to steal a Kalb story about Henry Kissinger, who, at one point, when he was getting a great deal of adulation because of his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, was approached at a large reception by a woman who took his hand in her two hands and said to him, "Mr. Secretary, I simply wanted to thank you for saving the world. And he looked back and he said, you're welcome. Needless to say, just being here tonight and to make this speech tonight is a great honor, perhaps the greatest since appearing on the Nixon enemies list. And when Marvin called to tell me that I'd been named and asked if I would come and make this speech, my impulse was to say, I thought you would never ask, right? There are all kinds of very warm associations tonight with this place and with the people who are here. First of all, Teddy White, who was a leader of our generation of journalists and who set the standard for all the rest of us. And then Joan Shorenstein Barone, whom I knew at CBS and who performed the quite improbable feat of being gentle and gracious while being a television producer. And Walter Shorenstein, who manages to be loved even though he gives money. He's been my friend since he volunteered some 20-odd years ago to drive me to San Francisco Airport after a lecture. I think Joan probably put him up to that. And then Marvin, and I guess you can tell the relationship between us, Marvin, whose life, whose family, whose interests have intertwined with my life, my interests, and my family since the first time in Moscow in 1956, he sat down to explain to me what really lay between the lines of Pravda. And then, of course, the association with Harvard, which has sponsored some of the work of my wife, Lee, and has seen to the education, or at least part of the education, of my daughter, Lisa. And I'm about to make her mad again by saying that she graduated from Harvard College a year or so on ago, summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. Lisa, I'm sorry, I had to say that. So this is something of a family affair altogether, but wait, there's more. It's also a matter of pride and perhaps a little bit of awe to be following to this podium Walter Cronkite and Ben Bradley. Warren Rudman, not being a journalist, doesn't count. I think of all those years at CBS when you would test a microphone by saying, well, Walter, well, Walter, well, Walter, well, Walter. And all the years in Washington with Ben Bradley, fearless, no-nonsense a journalist as I've ever known, even before he became Jason Robards. So I was rereading Walter's and Ben's lectures in preparation for doing this one, and I was struck by this common theme of we, the elders of our craft, re-examining where we are in this new media world. We become rather uncomfortably aware that Americans don't love us so much anymore. They are not inclined to forgive us our press passes. Somehow seems to be a long way from Hildy Johnson of the front page to the million-dollar blow-dried anchor person on television, and indeed somehow our whole profession seems sometimes to have been crowded into a small corner of a vast entertainment stage. We find ourselves competing with entertainment and sometimes borrowing the tools and the values of entertainment in this relentless quest for something called ratings. And we find this thing, reality, which has been so important in all our lives, reality. The word journalism translates as reality. You would want to present reality, find reality, save reality. And now we find that reality is yielding to something called reality-based, which I think is reality debased. Well, for the pain of self-doubt, there's nothing like a little self-flagellation to provide relief. So Dan Rather made a Murrow-esque speech to the news directors of Miami saying, they've got us putting more fuzz and wuzz on the air, competing not with other news programs or with entertainment programs. We should be ashamed of what we have done and not done, measured against what we could do. Kind of a faint echo of a great Murrow speech there. Comes out somehow differently. I don't know what Dan means by fuzz and wuzz. whether he considers being teamed with Connie Chung as an abdication to entertainment values. But then where do you draw the line? Surely Dan must be aware of the entertainment value that has contributed to his own great success. In the chorus of self-criticism we hear now, there's Peter Jennings telling TV Guide he wants to pay more attention to what conservatives are saying. We don't know enough about what conservatives are saying. And Janet Malcolm of the New Yorker, who says that every journalist who is not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what's going on knows that what he is doing is morally defensible. I don't know why she puts that all in the male gender, come to think of it. But she sees a journalist as a kind of a confidence man preying on the people he deals with. Well, I have some problems with the gospel, according to Janet Malcolm, who seems to have some ethics problems of her own. And yet the question that she raises, and that all these people raise, is very much on people's minds. What is the interface between journalists and the people we interview and write about and put on the air? Are we courageous scourges of the establishment? Or have we grown into an establishment ourselves? As some people think of us, more invasive, more overweening, more oversensitive, and more self-serving than the government and the political process that we profess to monitor. And furthermore, is one establishment in bed with the other? In a word, who's using whom and to what purpose? I'll never forget the cab driver who was driving me in from LaGuardia Airport to the Waldorf Astoria in 1974 to receive, with other CBS correspondents, some Emmy Awards for covering Watergate. And as we drove along across the bridge, he said, "Mr. Shore," flattering me by recognizing me, "why don't you reporters tell us what's really going on in Washington?" Well, I remonstrated that I was about to get a prize for telling him what was going on. But he shook his head and he said, "You're all together. You work it all out between you when somebody's going to be dumped. And then you go on, you and the people in the government, and you're afraid to tell us what's really going on." And from 1974 to today, that kind of has stuck with me as to why people perceive us that way. As to why is it that they really believe that somehow we have failed them and that we are not the public servants we profess to be, but we have all become rich on what we do and work with other rich people and work with other powerful people and exercise power in that way. So here was I, myself, the quintessential outsider, accused of this dreadful thing of being an insider. But how does it really work between the news media and the politicians? Who gains? Who loses? Who uses whom? And most of all, is the public served by the whole process? The question has to be examined at various levels because, well, the interaction between press and politicians has been evolving over the years. I think the politicians have been gaining on us in sophisticated techniques for manipulation. I wrote this before Ed Rollins. But now advancing technology of instantaneous worldwide communication in a very strange way is making life unpredictable for both of us, the politician and the press. The traditional relationship is, let me say so, is symbiotic, although we're reluctant to dwell on how often our successes are really somebody else's successes in using us. For example, let me give you this example. Marvin was telling you about experiences with Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow. In 1957, as CBS correspondent, I received a lot of credit for arranging the first ever television interview with a Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, from the Kremlin, not live from the Kremlin. Those were the days before live, before satellites, before color, before videotape, primitive days. But now let me tell you the secret of that scoop, never told before. A Soviet official called me at the bureau in Moscow and referred to the latest of the letters we wrote every month in which we said, when can we do a television interview someday, maybe, with Premier Nikolai Bulganin? And now the official on the phone said, well, we're still interested in an interview with Nikita Khrushchev. the head of the Communist Party. Well, sure, I said, not mentioning it was Bulganin we'd asked for and not for Khrushchev. And the result of all of that was an hour of Nikita Khrushchev on American TV, and President Eisenhower criticized CBS for letting this communist boss into America's living rooms. And how had it happened, and why did it happen? Was it my brilliance? Was it my persistence in getting Khrushchev? Was it some great coup of mine? Well, the fact of the matter was that you look at it in retrospect, and Khrushchev in 1957 was trying very hard to figure out a way to resume relations with the West, which had been torpedoed in 1956 by the bloodbath in Hungary. And he wanted American television to help him open his campaign of renewed coexistence that led 2 years later to a tour of America and his parley of President Eisenhower at Camp David. So what? Our scoop, his coup. He did it. Let me give you another example. In 1963, I was working on a documentary on communist espionage in West Germany, and I got an offer from the CIA. They could arrange for me an interview with an East German intelligence officer who had just defected and who would fit into my documentary very well. I said, great. He had stories to tell about how easy it was to penetrate West German security. Well, why did the CIA do this, offer me this thing? Because they wanted to needle the German government into cracking down on espionage. So there was an interview in a Frankfurt safe house to which I was invited to interview Lieutenant Gunther Maenel. I only mention the name because after all these years, the name still sticks in my mind. I didn't have to look it up. And he played his part in my documentary. Looked pretty good on CBS. It sure helped the CIA. Or closer to home. In 1976, I obtained the draft, Marvin's referred to it, I obtained the draft of the final report of a House Intelligence Committee which had been investigating and was recounting the failures and the misdeeds of the CIA. Ford administration was trying and eventually succeeded in having the report suppressed by the House in a 2-to-1 vote. But I had a copy of the report, and I arranged to have it published. I don't talk about sources. I didn't then, and now I don't either. But let me say that I am fully aware that I served somebody else's purpose in the grim game of seeing that this report did not sink forever down the memory hole. It is a fact that I took the best I could get. I wanted CBS to publish it. I asked newspapers to publish it. In the end, ended up with this report in the Village Voice. And oddly enough, after all these years, that is the only place in which that report has ever been published. It is still a secret in the House of Representatives. But what is that? I guess that's what you call a mutually beneficial arrangement, at least if you leave out some of the trouble I got into over it. But now we're on to the oldest established feature of who uses whom. This word leaks. The word leaks, I guess, is about as old as the word secrets. Leak is a kind of interesting verb anyway, if you're interested in just language. Originally, it was an intransitive verb when used. Something leaked, oozed out, escaped, seeped out somehow. And then somehow, in the arrangement between the press and the government, we turned an intransitive verb into a transitive verb. Now, things are leaked. Somebody leaks. And it becomes a different kind of thing. There are leakers, there are leaking sessions. Michael Kelly in the New York Times says that the former Secretary of State, Jim Baker, spent 35 hours a week leaking at a very high level. David Gergen was then assigned to leaking at a lower level. I think I'm going to drop that figure of speech pretty soon. One has to divide leaks into two general categories, the authorized leak and the unauthorized. President Nixon, Secretary Kissinger loved the one and they hated the other. The Watergate White House files are full of references to, we will leak this, we will leak that, this should be leaked to this columnist, let's give this one to Evans and Novak, let's give that one to what should be leaked to what magazine. The Howard Hunt forgery of a cable that was supposed to link President Kennedy to the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem was planned to be a leak to Life magazine. The information about a financial deal that drove Justice Abe Fortas from the Supreme Court was leaked to Life magazine. But unplanned leaks, that is, leaks that are unplanned by them, drove Nixon and Kissinger up the wall and into wiretaps of officials and journalists and into creating a leak plugging unit, aptly named the Plumbers, which dealt, among other things, with the biggest unplanned leak of all, the Pentagon Papers. Not everything that looks like a leak is a leak. This next paragraph I put in only after I knew that my friend Ben Bekdikhian was going to be here, because I wouldn't want to say this if he weren't here. But Ben Bekdikhian, writing about leaks in the Columbia Journalism Review in 1961, said that West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer had, quote, successfully leaked stories, unquote, to Flora Lewis, who was then of the Washington Post, and myself, who was then correspondent of CBS in Bonn. The story in question had to do with Adenauer's criticism of President Kennedy at a closed-door party caucus of his in Bonn. And in fact, I can say this, and you'll have to believe me, that it had not been deliberately leaked by anyone, but it was a story that was pieced together by the strenuous efforts of 4 reporters working together over a long period of time. And so, because of the assumption that anything that appears that looks like a leak has to be a leak, I wrote a letter to the Columbia Journalism Review to let Ben know that some stories are not given but gotten. Not everything is that kind of leak. There's also something that might be called a secondary leak. Let me tell you about that. In January 1975, President Ford let slip at a White House luncheon with the publisher of the New York Times and editors and columnists that the CIA had been involved in assassination conspiracies. Then Ford, realizing he'd made a small error, tried to pull it back by saying, listen, can we consider this off the record? And later on, publisher Arthur O. Sulzberger, much to the distress of some of his staff, ordered that this explosive remark not be pursued. Well, it came to my ears, never mind how, and that resulted in an exclusive on the CBS Evening News that precipitated a Senate investigation and finally the exposure of CIA's efforts in league with the mafia to try to eliminate Fidel Castro. Well, again, without quite discussing my source, I can say that no one in authority in the US government, and certainly no one in authority in the New York Times, wanted that leak to occur, and neither of them benefited from it. But the public, I submit, did benefit, and mightily. This exposed to daylight one of the darkest chapters in the CIA's history, a secret that the agency had scandalously kept from the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. And if those plots to assassinate Castro had been known to the Warren Commission back then, in 1963-64, they might have better understood the motivations of Lee Harvey Oswald, who knew about the assassination plots because Castro had talked about them publicly, and who, chances are, was the self-appointed avenger of Castro against Kennedy. There are some terrible ironies there that these plots, either initiated by the Kennedys or initiated on their behalf, in the end may have been an arrow sent into the air against Castro that came back to kill President Kennedy. But none of that could be investigated back then because those things were kept secret until President Ford, who was a member of the Warren Commission and didn't know about it then, but learned about it as president and decided to confide it to a few people in the New York Times. Anybody here curious about the identity of probably the most talked about and speculated about leaker of modern times, that is Deep Throat? All right, yes, I hear. Have you wondered why somebody who was apparently so inside as to know what was going on would be so disloyal to President Nixon and in addition take such risks? Well, I believe that that case has been broken by Jim Mann, who was a reporter then for the Washington Post at the time that Bob Woodward was, and a colleague of his who now works for the Los Angeles Times. And then he had it all worked out straight in an article he wrote for Atlantic magazine. And it goes this way. I believe it. I mean, I'm utterly convinced by it. Deep Throat was one or more of 3 top-level FBI officials who were furious because Nixon had picked an outsider, L. Patrick Gray, to succeed J. Edgar Hoover as the head of the FBI. Furious also that Gray and the White House were obstructing the investigation of Watergate, which would then make the Bureau end up looking bad. And so was the Watergate conspiracy punctured by G-men, jealous of their turf and jealous of the Bureau's reputation? I think so. So where does that end up? Woodward and Bernstein got the Pulitzer Prize. The FBI got Nixon. Who used whom? What was that about? Speaking of Nixon, would it amuse you to learn that recently I was the beneficiary of a leak from old enemies list Nixon himself? He had written a memorandum about how President Ford was missing the boat on aid to Russia. And he circulated his memorandum to a list of friends that did not include me. My friend, Bill Sapphire, showed it to me, but stipulated that I could not use it without Nixon's permission. I noticed something about the memo, and that is that it didn't have anything about secret, confidential, please don't carry this on. There was nothing in the memo. And Nixon's pretty good at saying secret when he wants to say secret. And he had said nothing about that. And so I called Nixon's office in New Jersey and asked his assistant whether she would ask him whether could I please quote a little bit of the memo. She instantly said it would be not necessary to consult him, that she knew that it would be fine. Well, it sounded as though she'd been waiting for my call. So I got a story, and Nixon, as he undoubtedly planned, put a shot across President Bush's bow, but in a way that enabled him to say that this wasn't a press release, he hadn't meant to tell the press about it, it was just a private memorandum that leaked. Leaked? Was leaked? I think more was leaked myself. And I was an instrument. And we're all instruments in these things. But what the hell, it's a story and people ought to know about it. And if in the course of this you are an instrument, well, that's how the game is and that's how it's played. But in the current phase of our public life, I mean, those were the days when you get a leak now and then and you'd be very proud of it. But in the current phase of our public life, a leak has become so commonplace as to be totally devalued. Just isn't the way it used to be. Television correspondents now routinely report what the president's going to say in a speech tomorrow, and names of prospective nominees are floated and withdrawn without regard to their reputations. All of this leaks. There's hardly an official report starting with a budget that you won't find summarized somehow in the papers and on radio and television before it's released. Whatever happened to the embargo? For some of us who were in journalism for a long time, there's a thing, embargo, a mutually convenient arrangement where if you wanted to study a report, you'd get it 2 or 3 days in advance, but not to be released until a certain time. It's gone. It just all seeps and gets out now. The leak has anyway been absorbed into a much bigger kind of industry. That's called the spin. It's not a leak anymore, it's a spin. Secret keeping has now fallen to the big industry of image making. So the massaging of the media, the care and feeding of the media, somehow have come almost to overshadow the policy making process, the decision making process. First you sort of leak something to the press, you feed the press, then you get feedback, feed, and the feedback. If the feedback is negative, You go and do some changes in the thing you were planning to say, and that's called fine-tuning. You take, for example, the Clinton Health Reform Program, 9 months of gestation and trial balloons back and forth, and went through so much fine-tuning as to be worthy of an orchestra. The White House image-making corps now goes steadily larger. David Gergen, the communicator, is now also the policy advisor. The danger is that communicating will become not only a way of explaining policy, but that it will become a way of it'll dictate the policy, and ultimately it will become the policy. The policy will be what sounds right to be the policy in this strange interaction we have now between policymakers and the media. So, spin patrol, damage control, message of the day, the process has become so ingrained as to make governing seem in itself like a form of theater. And no one was better at it than President Reagan. When I was at CNN, one of my functions was, when President Reagan gave an evening news conference, I'd be out on the lawn right after the news conference to do something called instant analysis. And typically, I would get up and, with my clipboard in hand and say, Mr. Reagan made the following 5 factual errors tonight in his press conference. And would you think I'd be thanked for that? No, I wasn't thanked for that. I would get many calls and letters of protest about my bias against the president. Who uses whom? I mean, Reagan used television superbly and well, managed to project an image which made facts almost irrelevant after a while. And did I ever do anything to Reagan? I think not. I think I didn't affect any of that. President Clinton has now added still another dimension to governing by theater. He's effectively hijacked television from the journalists by talking over their heads, and don't think we don't get mad about it. He talks over the heads to town meetings, talks to MTV, talks to Larry King, and then reporters and columnists and commentators have now become supplicants, and they ask can they have a meeting with him. They want to be invited to a lunch with the president so they can write something that he hasn't already said on the air. That's becoming very difficult. I've not yet been invited to any of those lunches. Never mind, I can always have lunch with Nixon. It is curious that President Clinton, who's commanded more media exposure than any president in history, complains that he's not getting across the story of his accomplishments. He's constantly complaining. On NBC's Meet the Press the other day, he quoted people in his hometown as saying, quote, there must be a conspiracy to keep this a secret, talking about some of his great achievements. And he ruminated about whether this may be my fault or it may be somebody else's fault. Well, who uses whom? The president really cannot complain of a lack of access to the public. And if he comes off in the end sometimes, and this was written before yesterday, and I have to change it after yesterday, if he comes off in the end as less than coherent, then he will have to consult his scattershot style, his handlers, or his policies. There is nothing that we in the media have done to make things bad for him. And it's interesting that I wrote that, and that yesterday, if I had to write this now, I'd say that he finally found his voice, that he finally managed to find a way of saying that I don't compromise everything, and that everything is an accommodation, and that not everything is half a loaf. Here's this thing, and I can't change it because it's been negotiated with Mexico and Canada, and I'm going to stick my neck out and my chin out, and I may lose. And the fact that he was willing to take that risk and work that hard at it has certainly projected a different image. If he can manage to maintain the image of the guy who's willing to take the chance of losing over something that he considers a matter of principle, then we will be seeing, I was about to say, a new Clinton, but I remember the new Nixons we used to see. I don't want to. But now, having said that press used politicians, politicians used the press in a largely symbiotic and not always symbiotic relationship. But now we come to the next stage on this who is using whom business, the stage in which television itself as a technology takes control out of the hands of the press and policymaker alike. President Reagan saw on television, for example, relatives of hostages in Lebanon who blamed him for not doing enough to bring home their loved ones. And he said, they're killing us with that. We got to do something about the hostages. This was not anything that journalists had done. It was simply a reflection of what happens when he saw something on television. It had its own very potent effect. And so he saw this political problem, and he launched his ransom by arms sale initiative. President Bush, having decided to get American troops very quickly home from the Gulf in 1991, suddenly became aware that America was looking at frightful scenes of Kurds in flight from Iraqi genocide. And because he saw this on television, but not because he was reacting to it, but because he knew America was looking at it, and America was reacting to it, he sent the troops back to protect the Kurds. He said, no one can see the pictures and not be deeply moved. And you know that when Americans are moved, then politicians move. That's what makes them move. Television scenes of suffering in Bosnia, and led President Clinton to join in the humanitarian aid effort and to promise more aid than he was able to deliver in protecting the Bosnians. Somalia is a classic case of pictures dictating policy. In Somalia, scenes of starvation pulled America into a humanitarian and then military intervention, and then other scenes of an American prisoner and an American soldier being dragged through the streets drove the president to pull the troops out of Somalia. Going in and coming out were a function of reaction to the pictures that you see today on television. National Security Advisor Anthony Lake confessed that the pictures helped to make us recognize that the military situation in Mogadishu had deteriorated in a way that we'd frankly not recognize. Think of that. He's got military people there, he's got a couple of generals over there, and he needs pictures on television to tell him that the situation has deteriorated. But deterioration on television is different from real deterioration. Deterioration on television is an aspect that drives policy because it means that not only do we know, but the public knows, and the public reacts. And we have to react to the way that the public reacts. Secretary of State Christopher made a remarkable statement before a Senate Foreign Relations Committee 2 weeks ago. Quote, television is a wonderful phenomenon and sometimes even an instrument of freedom. But television images cannot be the North Star of America's foreign policy. Who says it can't? Because I think it is. I think that our constant lurches in policy don't happen for no reason at all. I think that long before we reach that thing called the information highway, we're coming close to something called an interactive system of policy formulation. And the instantaneity of modern television makes it necessary to formulate that policy on the run. That's another aspect of it. You know, in the old days, Richard Reeves, in his great book on President Kennedy, reports one small incident about how I covered the beginning of the Berlin Wall early on a Sunday morning in August 1961. And he records that by the time the film reached New York and got on the air on the next available news program, Kennedy and his staff had time to read the cables they got from Germany, consult their allies, and decide how to react. That doesn't work quite that way anymore. If it happened today, officials would see the event along with all Americans on television about the time it was happening. They saw the wall coming down on television. If we had had satellite transmission back then, they would have seen the wall going up on television, and the administration would have had to scramble for a public response before they could consult anybody and know what their response really should be. In any event, however, the picture is far from being the whole reality, and that's the trouble. But images now tend to replace reality or to create their own reality. We are spellbound by pictures of the assault on Parliament in Moscow and on the Ostankino television center, which may have been the more crucial battleground. But we're given very little understanding of what's happening behind the facade of all of this. And so we end up reacting to pictures to show you what pictures can show and not knowing those things which pictures can show, and that is a new reality. It is a reality of what is on television. Where's journalism? Where are we, the journalists? I mean, these are pictures. Anybody can put a camera on pictures and show pictures. We call that a news program and so on, but it really isn't. It's a thing happening. It's what they call an actuality. It doesn't have any explanation. It doesn't have any meaning, but it can drive policy today. And we journalists catch up more slowly and much less vividly, with much less impact on radio and in print, and much less impact on the people who make the policy based on what they see in the television age. That also happens some in domestic policy, I think. When policy is driven by television, it tends to be driven by that reality that television creates. Vivid displays of violence, including juvenile violence, create an impression of a pervasive crime all over the country. FBI statistics indicate that violent crime has been decreasing in large cities in recent years. But there are higher ratings on television to be found in anecdotes of blood and gore than in statistics or analysis of where crime is, and what crime is, and why crime is. So that you find a crime bill being fashioned today not by the reality of crime and the reality of what causes crime, but by pictures. If you see in the schoolyard kids lying dead, we want 100 people guarding that schoolyard right away. And the reaction is the reaction to the anecdotal part of it rather than to the real meaning of it. The whole reality on which government proceeds has become slightly altered. So great is the obsession with perception and spin that spin tends to become the policy. And if projections of 40% of Americans paying more for health care create a firestorm as it did, no problem. Tomorrow we'll have some other projections. We'll see how we'll try that out on television. If the news media play up stories like the president's haircut and the White House travel office and the suicide of Vincent Foster, I think it may be in part because these are among the few remaining spontaneous stories that had eluded the handlers and eluded the spin doctors. And therefore they get an awful lot of attention because there are not many of them anymore. Who uses whom? We journalists have tried so hard to serve as guardians of reality only to be no longer sure if there is a reality and if our bosses care whether there is a reality. The spin doctors are gaining on us, but technology is gaining on all of us and both of us. In the Gulf War, the censors did a pretty good job of controlling coverage. In the landing on that beach in Somalia, television made a mockery of the best laid plans of mice and managers. In the next war involving Americans, news management may be defeated by all the latest wrinkles, minicams, portable dishes, and cellular phones. It is not the world that I came into when I came into journalism. But all I want to say is that for 60 years, I've loved journalism, not always wisely, but well. I have loved the news profession, not always the news industry. I think Teddy White would have understood about that. Some 45 years ago, E.B. White, that great essayist, saw the coming age of television as a race between things that are and things that seem to be. I think were he here today, he'd say that seems to be is running far ahead. I just hope that a younger generation of journalists will run very hard to reclaim things that are. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do have time to ask Mr. Shore a number of questions, and I see two microphones here on the ground floor, and if I could see through those lights, there may even be microphones up there. But please approach the microphones, and when you ask your question, make it brief, identify yourself, and then Dan will answer it equally briefly. But I want to get started with one question. I see a number of my students out here, and those people who take PPP 100 know that there's a question that keeps coming up over and over again, and that is, let us assume that everything that you have described is right on target. What effect does all of this have upon the vitality of American democracy?
That is a tough one, because I think on the whole, that American democracy has been well served up until recently by the media considered large. I think I'm beginning to think that the total effect of the media, by which I don't mean the journalists in the media, but the media taken together, the merging off into the semi-entertainment and finally entertainment, that the total effect is to leave Americans confused, impatient, cynical, untrusting of government, untrusting of almost anything. I have to say that I wasn't really prepared for that question. The trouble is, when I'm not prepared, I tell the truth. I think the net effect has not been healthy for our democracy as things are now going.
Meaning what if you look ahead 25 years?
Well, meaning what if we look ahead is that there is we have an intensification of this tendency to assume that people are crooked, that nothing is being done right, that nothing that is done by public-spirited people can be right, and the only way you can win on anything is to win in a the short way to put it is that one of these days we will find America dominated by Ross Perot's. People who can afford to buy television time and be effective demagogues on television. That's what I'm afraid of.
Can this be turned around in your view? Is there a way of turning this Queen Mary around?
I wish I could say that. I think we work at trying to turn it around. I think that there's a poison out there, and we, if we are really very good journalists, become a kind of an antidote to that poison. Whether the antidote can be administered in sufficient quantity to really neutralize the whole poison, I don't know. But when somebody stands up there and says, the thing that you just heard this person say, he's lying. And let me tell you why he's lying. That makes a small contribution to trying to bring things into balance. Or put around the other way, to say, don't think that everything that is called government is bad because this has happened and is good, and here's something that's worked out and it's worked well and should be encouraged. I mean, it is the sense that somehow journalism has to separate itself from the media in a way that I'm not sure I don't know how it's going to happen. And that reporters have to sort of draw back from being part of the great performance and say that there are responsibilities that they have. I'm not fully prepared, as you can tell, for that serious a discussion, so let me stop before I make more mistakes.
Mike Berlin.
Hi, my name is Mike Berlin. I ask you this because I don't think you're typical of Washington reporters. Many young reporters, if they're worth their salt, if they're covering City Hall, and the mayor tries to lay something on them, will say to themselves, is the story what the mayor has just told me, or is the story why the mayor is trying to sell this to me? What is it about the magnetic qualities of the Washington Beltway that causes reporters who cross it to cease asking themselves this question and simply relay what it is that James Baker or David Gergen is trying to leak to them?
Part of it is soundbite television. It happens more in television than it happens in radio, and it happens more in, and newspapers are something else. But the fact of the matter is that television has come to hate talking heads, especially journalistic talking heads, and therefore likes to go with the soundbite of the important person saying the important thing. If at the end the journalist got 15 seconds to try to say what's wrong with that, it doesn't work.
I'm talking about the leak, though. The
The
leak
leak.
to the New York Times, yeah.
The leak.
From Baker.
The leak, I've tried to explain about the leak, that the leak is a very complicated matter. It is that very rarely is something deliberately leaked.
Then that's
which
the
doesn't-
question.
which
Is
doesn't
the
have-
story the leak, or is the story why this person is trying to leak it? And why don't reporters in Washington
Well,
ask that
that's
more
an
frequently?
interesting question also. I mean, it's certainly a valid story to know why Deep Throat, or let's say persons who leak something to me, why they do it. It's a valid story. It is, alas, a story I'm not in a position to tell, because I have obligated myself as a condition for getting the story to maintain the confidentiality of that source. Now, if somebody, by some act of enterprise, manages to find out the source, it can, on occasion, be a very valid story. No question about it. The source of leaks are frequently very interesting things to know, but they can't be told to you by persons who have promised not to.
And we turn to the right. Nick Danilov.
Dan, I suppose my question is a bit of a follow-up on Marvin's excellent and central question in all of this. In the late 1950s, when I began becoming a journalist, we used to believe that the government told us the truth, that it made sensible decisions, and it didn't lie to its people. Today, I'm involved in teaching the younger generation the few lessons that I've learned, and I find that they are incredibly critical, at least in comparison to the way I was 30 or 40 years ago, if not to say cynical. Perhaps it is that these very critical and cynical young men and women will have a better chance of recapturing reality from that deceptive image, which is the trademark of Washington today. What do you think?
I hope so. I mean, I live these ebbing years of my life in the fond hope that that will happen. Unfortunately, the way our industry has developed, there is a tendency for people that we still call journalists, but they learn techniques, they learn about carrying a camera around, they learn a lot of things which is not directly connected with what we would have called news and journalism, and frequently it passes for it. I'm sometimes appalled by the lack of basic background information that people, in speaking especially of local television stations, let me say, the background information that they have, and yet go on calling themselves journalists, and yet they don't really understand about these things. I think somehow everything runs in cycles, and these cycles at some point have to run to an end. The cycle we're in, I think, started somewhere during the Vietnam War, when America, which on the whole, up until that time, had worked on an assumption of regularity between the press and the government, between the government and the people, began to learn such things as the government could lie. And then in the case of Nixon and to some extent Reagan, Bush, that the government actually spent a lot of time lying, and a certain then amount of time in covering up its lies. And as these things come out, and we learned everything from Watergate to Iran-gate, Iraq-gate, all those gates, after a while, there comes that awful sense of, if it's so easy for the government to lie, when do you know if the government is telling the truth? In part, it is because the government reacts and seeing what's happening on television, quickly runs to try to control the damage that's been done. And before they know themselves sometimes what the truth is, in case anybody knows, my problem is I'm not sure anybody understands if there is such a thing as objective facts anymore. That cycle somehow has to play itself out. Don't ask me why I think so, but if I did think so, I'd be very pessimistic. And I think that all of this, in the end, will play itself out. Maybe Clinton will bring a new communitarian spirit back into the government. I don't know. Maybe we will have some great rebirth, and with that, a rebirth of journalism in this country. But as of yesterday, I was not very optimistic.
Thank you.
Thanks. Right there.
I'm curious to know.
Could you identify yourself?
My name is Eric Simon. I'm curious to know what some of your opinions would be about Noam Chomsky's observations of the media in America. For example, one of his suggestions that the media imposes upon themselves a form of control or maybe self-censorship more stringent than something that the government might might impose. An example he gives, for example, is the fact that human rights abuses in Nicaragua would be microscoped, whereas human rights abuses in El Salvador would be glossed over or reported much less. I want to know your opinion on that.
Generally, Chomsky tends to look for conspiracies in the media. It is my own general impression that the media are more manipulated than they are manipulating. We find these horrible, here we find out very late that what was being reported about death squads in El Salvador was true, although the government was denying it. And it takes a long time, finally. I mean, some very good reporters reported at the time. It wasn't taken serious. It's very difficult for reporters to stand up against the majesty of government denying something. But the only part of it where I really part company with Chomsky, whom I'm very happy to part company with most of the time, is that in his search for conspiracies, he assumes that whatever we do which may have been a failure was a deliberate failure. And it's usually not. It usually is, we were had.
Susan Moeller, you gave us some compelling examples of the ways in which policy is driven by television. I wonder if you'd comment on the converse of that. To what extent, and perhaps to what effect, would you say that the news, perhaps both print and broadcast from your background, is driven by pictures?
So what's the end of that?
By pictures. In other words, how is the news driven by pictures?
Oh, I think pictures are the thing today. I mean, pictures dominate. Television dominates, and pictures dominate television. And the vast number of people that be asked what their impressions are of what's going on in the world are more likely to have gotten them from pictures than from anything that they've heard just with their ears or read only with their eyes. It is a pictorial medium. We live in a pictorial world. And people now find symbolic pictures. I mean, I mentioned this symbolic picture of an American soldier's body was being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. This is one soldier, one body. But for pictures, a powerful image, and therefore had very powerful effect on policy.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
My name's Mitch Golden. I think that your cab driver from 1974 would not have been especially reassured by what you're saying tonight. And I guess my question that I want to ask goes to the heart of how not the media interacts with politicians, but how it interacts with itself, in particular in light of the question asked by the fellow who was in front of me. You just described a case in which the New York Times essentially decided not to publish a story in which they knew a criminal activity had gone on. And you also described a situation in which no one but the Village Voice published a story in which criminal activities are covered up or went on. What are the forces that keep the media from publishing a story like that? How is it that the Village Voice is the only place in the country that we can find out a story like that? Or how is it that the New York Times would not want to publish such a major story as that once they know about it? It's no longer a question of their interactions with politicians, because they have the information. It's a question of their interactions with themselves and with other media.
Yeah, I have to expose a small factual part of this, which will explain why the New York Times never did. I thought the New York Times also had a copy of the report. They had summarized the report at great length on their front page. I'd worked on the assumption, therefore, that there had been collateral, another leak to the New York Times, and furthermore, I had put the disposal of this thing in the hands of others, who finally came up with and said, Village Voice or maybe New York Magazine, one of the two, will publish it. At that point, whoever. The real question is, if I can just take part of that question, is why working for CBS and having gotten this as a CBS correspondent and having already done reports based on this thing on CBS, when I went to CBS and said, we own two publishing houses. When the New York Times did the Pentagon Papers, it ended up by publishing a book with the Pentagon Papers by New York Times Books. So why should CBS and one of its publishing enterprises not publish this as a historical record? The answer was, dummy, because we're not a newspaper, we're in a regulated industry. And because there was a time when cable was beginning to come up and Congress was considering cable, and the television industry was frightened about what Congress might do, and this was a matter of taking on the whole House of Representatives. And CBS said, you're out of your mind if you think we'll risk something like that. So the answer to the question is, it's different for television. It's different for television because television has to worry about licenses, competition of cables, a lot of strange things that Congress does which you don't understand, but which can cost television a lot of money at times, and their unwillingness to do what a decent newspaper would have done at that time.
I'm going to ask, without any implication that Dan has been going on too long in his answers, that both the question and answers be shortened up so that we get everybody in.
Right.
Please.
Sound bites from now on.
No, no. No, I mean, you can go 30 seconds.
Thank you very much for speaking tonight, Mr. Shore. My name is Jarrett Blanc. I'm a freshman at the college. I was wondering, it seems that some organizations, news organizations, do a much better job of reporting. The Economist, McNeil Lehrer, NPR. Is it simply because they get the best talent, or do they have some sort of structure that keeps their eyes on the objective facts? As someone who's worked in so many organizations, can you give some light on that?
Part of it has to do with the tyranny of time. Public television and public radio have the luxury, because they're not selling large slices of commercial time, have the luxury of being able to do things at some length. If you start by having the length at which to do it, then you can figure out how to do something in more depth than it would otherwise be done. Part of it is simply as simple as that. The Economist is simply a good magazine. It's in a different area. You know, the Republic is sometimes interesting. Other magazines are. But the competition in the electronic media is between the public side of it, which without a lot of money still puts on material in depth, and the commercial networks and cable, where they are in constant competition with non-news and non-journalistic things, because all of them have to be able to get ratings. And that's the 30-second answer.
No, it's even longer than that. But you know, when you think about all of journalism, the entire journalistic product, it does include news organizations that do a splendid job, and a whole bunch of them that do a dreadful job. And the question is, in Dan's speech, I think, you get the sense of pulling toward the negative, toward debasing the quality of news coverage and presentation. But it does not have to be that way. And there are any number of news organizations led by superior people, some of them I look at right here, who do a terrific job every single day. So it isn't, I don't want to leave the impression, and I'm sure that Dan doesn't want to either, that we are looking at a ship simply sinking into the Atlantic Ocean and never to arise again. There are tremendous forces at work that are both good and bad, and we shouldn't get lost just focusing on the bad, although at the moment we're in that cycle where it does seem to be predominant. Now there's a face over in front of that microphone that many of us, take a good look at, belongs to George Herman, CBS News. Go ahead.
I don't have to introduce myself, thank you. Dan, I'm curious as to why you calmly accepted the slander that Mr. Berlin delivered on the character of Washington correspondents. That once we get inside the Beltway, we stop asking ourselves, why did he tell me that, and what did he mean by that? Do you believe that's true?
No, but what I was addressing myself to there was the end point of that question was, is the identity of someone who leaks something not also something of possible interest? And I have to admit that it is. But for the rest, we weigh leaks, we try to measure what's leaked against other information, check it out, and all the rest of it. But thank you for letting me amend that part of it.
But didn't you, every time somebody confided something to you, say to yourself, I wonder what he means by that. What is he trying to sell? Is this a case of Akhmir Chainik? What's going on?
Yes, that's right. One of the questions is why, but there are ways of doing that. You go to other people who are involved and other people who are interested, and balance it against other kinds of information. Frequently, some of it will end up being a better story than the one that you were told in the first place.
Please.
Thank you again for being here. I'm struck both in listening to you and in Karen Clark. And in the class that I'm taking here as a mid-career student about the difference between the ideals of journalism and the practice of it. And some of it seems to me to be a matter of accountability. And I'm just wondering, with your experience, if you have any wish for certain structures of accountability that don't now exist within your profession.
Well, if I account, I was, every once in a while somebody says, you know, First Amendment, fine, we will make no law abridging, and yet somehow the press has to be accountable, and let's figure out some way to have it accountable. And my former boss, my late former boss, Dick Salant, at one time supported something called the National Press Council, in which, with the support of newspapers, if you had a complaint that something was unfair, you would go to the Press Council, and that they would then sort of have a form of trial of one sort or another and decide who was right and who was wrong. Other friends of mine objected. I, in the end, objected. It is unfortunately true that the only accountability the press has ultimately is the accountability of people who see, or people who listen, or people who read. There is no way under our constitutional system of making that you can't license journalists. Well, some people have talked of licensing journalists. You can't put them up before anybody that everybody else would respect to judge whether this was right or wrong. In many cases, to do so would have to go into confidential sources, which they wouldn't tell you anyway. And disorderly though this system is, and I agree that it would be nice if we had some way of making the press accountable. The ways of making it accountable, I think, are more dangerous than living with this little disorder we live with now.
Thanks for the question. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Daniel Allen. I'm also a freshman here at the college. There seems to me that there's a consolidation of the news media industry to some extent. For example, ABC, I believe, is in a partnership with BBC, and the New York Times has bought the Boston Globe. I was wondering what you thought, whether you think this is good or bad for the industry, since I guess it creates less competition for the...
Well, it's better to have Bosnia and Somalia reported by BBC than not reported at all on American television. But that this great country, America, has come to have to rely on the television networks of a little country called England to tell us what's going on in the world is at the very least embarrassing.
Thank you. Another gentleman, CBS News.
Blair Clark, as a former colleague of yours, Dan.
Come on, you were my boss.
Nobody was your boss.
And George Herman's boss.
I deny it. I was just a colleague. Anyway, I'm going to ask a question that your only answer is relevant to the themes, the theses of what you have in mind. And that is about a certain correspondent on the border of what we used to call the evil empire and the free world. Do we still use either of those words? And an enterprise which he was involved with for his journalistic home, which he was ordered to stop for reasons of security. Does that have anything to do? If not, we'll talk about it at the symposium tomorrow.
I thought we had. But what Blair, I think, is referring to is how he, as news director of CBS once, when I was in Berlin, and engaged in a project of getting a really wonderful story of some people who were trying to build a tunnel under the Berlin Wall. And one day I was asked to come to the U.S. mission in Berlin late at night. I said, for what? He said, for a phone call from your boss. I said, why can't he call me in the hotel? And it's because he has to use a secure line. I said, well, okay, we're now down secure. So I went to the U.S. mission, and there was Blair Clark speaking to me from the State Department and saying that what I'm advised here is that what you're about to do is very dangerous and could endanger people and endanger the national interest of the United States. And I said, well, malarkey. I mean, you know, this is a story that I think we ought to do. And he ordered that I not do it. Why he wanted to boast of that, I don't know, but okay. The upshot of it was that NBC went and did it and got prizes for having done it.
Well, a footnote is the circumstances were that I was summoned by Rusk, the Secretary of State, at midnight to the State Department. Pierre Salinger was there, 3 CIA people, and they produced what looked like proof that the tunnel was compromised and that dozens of East Germans going through the tunnel were going to be killed. I never have known whether it was true, but under the circumstances, it didn't seem to me I could say anything but what I said. But I wondered whether, on reflection after 40 years or 30, you had any other who does what to whom thoughts about that.
No, but I'd like to interview you on that subject.
Anytime, free.
We have time for one more question. Hi, my name is Joe Hogan, and here in Boston we've seen a local news station bought by a businessman in Miami who's promising to turn it into you know, more glitzy news, a lot more gore and exciting things like that. And we've seen Time Magazine go to the fast format reading and that sort of thing. I'm wondering, you know, we've talked about like cycles. I don't necessarily see a cycle back to good quality journalism in the popular press and TV. And I was wondering, you know, what does it take? Because TV stations do have to survive on the ratings, but, you know, when do we see something like Nightline or NPR succeeding in prime time and people paying attention?
I think it's wonderful that, you know, that a program like Nightline survives at what has become now a very important time of night. It wasn't when they first did it. I think that's great, and I think that, you know, you look for these little pearls among the rubbish, and you pick at the pearls and you look at them and you enjoy them. I don't know what's going to turn it around, frankly, very soon. Speaking of television, because television is the most important part of the problem. Speaking of television, what we really have is that the 3 networks are fighting rather desperately for slices of a shrinking pie. And in the course of doing that, ratings dictate everything, because the ratings will dictate advertising rates and profits, if any. And therefore, in the search for ratings, they learn that if you can't do your best because you make more money by doing your worst. That you really need elements of drama, violence, sex, anything which is vivid and dramatic and involves conflict. And if that doesn't have anything to do with the way what's really happening in the world, so be it. I mean, that is the age that we are in, as long as we are in an age of commercial television. Cable is making it worse because cable is coming up with ever worse things and lowering the common denominator. Enjoy Nightline, enjoy NPR, enjoy what we have left, because there isn't very much.
Hang on. One of the wonderful things about these Teddy White speeches is that when the speech is over, the event continues. And it will continue tomorrow morning in the penthouse way upstairs in this building. From 9:30 to 11:30, there'll be a seminar at which Dan will be present and talking about some of the ideas, the many interesting and provocative ideas that he put before us this evening. And joining him tomorrow and leading that discussion will be Linda Wertheimer, who is right here with us on NPR, and four panelists, Ellen Goodman, Clarence Page, David Shribman, and Ben Bagdikian. That'll be tomorrow at 9:30 to 11:30 upstairs. And I just want to say on behalf of all of us that the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center chose well when it chose Daniel Schorr to do this lecture. Good job. didn't do anything. He's the speaker. You're not kidding.
Heather had to leave.
Oh, okay.
Thanks again. Good luck
Not at all.
tomorrow.
Thank you.